Welcome to the debate. Today, we're conducting an autopsy. But we aren't standing over a body found in a field. We're looking at a murder that happened inside the architecture of human consciousness itself. We are conducting a structural reexamination of the Cain and Abel narrative.
And to be clear right from the jump, we aren't treating this as some kind of Bronze Age crime scene investigation. We're not looking for fingerprints. We are looking at the source materials theory that this story is a code, a very specific, almost technical description of how one mode of human thinking conquered another.
Exactly. We are exploring what's called the Abel hypothesis. The proposal is that Abel isn't just a victim in a religious text, but a representation of interpretive fluency, the ability to perceive layered, vertical meaning in the world. And Cain is the force of literalism, of control, and the suppression of that nuance.
It is a fascinating, if pretty dense proposal. But it brings us immediately to the friction point I'm going to be hammering on today. If Abel represents a high-context, layered way of speaking and thinking, that inherently creates a divide. I mean, it separates the world into those who hear the hidden layer and those who just don't.
Which leads us to our central question. Is the secrecy we see in some of these ancient traditions a result of intentional, conspiratorial exclusion? Or is it a phenomenon of what the text calls interpretive asymmetry, a natural byproduct of a communication style that is simply too bandwidth heavy for the uninitiated to process?
I'll be taking the position of the external observer. And while I see the structural elegance of the symbolic hypothesis, I intend to scrutinize the social cost. My argument is that a communication style that relies on hidden layers is, well, functionally, it's indistinguishable from deception. You can call it fluency, but to the outsider, it just looks like a locked door.
And I will argue that the door is not locked. It is simply heavy. I posit that this symbolic architecture is a preservation tool, not a weapon. What looks like secrecy is actually developmental opacity. The meaning isn't hidden from the observer, it is simply ahead of them.
That's a convenient defense for a closed circle. But let's test the foundation. Walk us through the architecture of this hypothesis before we try to tear it down.
Okay, to understand Abel, we have to look at narrative architecture. The source material anchors this in the Hebrew textual tradition. Originally, this community identity, it wasn't formed around a secret handshake or a conspiracy. It was formed around covenant theology and textual guardianship.
Guardianship? That implies something is being protected from someone. That's the first red flag for me.
Or preserved for someone. The distinction matters. The argument is that the text itself was the central organizing principle. Abel, which etymologically links to breath or vapor or spirit, represents the capacity to read that text and the world as having a vertical dimension. It's the ability to see that a physical event can simultaneously be a spiritual signal.
So Abel is essentially the faculty of pattern recognition?
In a very specific sense, yes. It's what the text calls participatory interpretation. In this framework, the killing of Abel is an archetypal description of a shift in human consciousness. It symbolizes the moment when instrumental materialism, represented by Cain, the tiller of the ground, the man of direct acquisition, decides that ambiguity is just inefficient. Cain kills Abel because literalism cannot tolerate the uncertainty of poetic truth.
So you're saying the death of Abel is the death of our ability to read between the lines?
It's the death of the ability to believe there are lines to read between. It asserts that what outsiders so easily dismiss as mysticism is actually a disciplined practice of reading language as multivalent, as having many values at once. It's not magic. It's literacy at a higher bandwidth.
I can appreciate the romance of that idea. I really can. The notion that we've traded depth for efficiency. But I want to pivot to the reality of how this plays out in a room with two people. I'm looking at the section on the architecture of layered fluency. The source material explicitly notes that to an outsider, this depth appears indistinguishable from concealment, misdirection, or secrecy.
Perceived indistinguishability is not the same as structural identity. I mean, just because a pilot and a magician both do things I don't understand doesn't mean they're both tricking me.
But in a social context, perception is reality.
If a community speaks in a way where words function as literal exchange and relational positioning at the same time, they're effectively conducting two conversations at once. One is public, the literal words. The other is private, the coded meaning.
That's the definition of a high-context culture. It's efficiency.
It is also the definition of exclusion. This creates what the text calls interpretive asymmetry. You have one group operating with full information and another group operating with partial information, yet both of them think they are in the same conversation. So while you argue the intent is the preservation of meaning, the effect is that the literal listener, the Cain, is being managed.
Managed or guided?
If I don't know I'm being guided, I'm being managed. I have to question whether this asymmetry is inherently stabilizing, as the hypothesis claims. If I can't understand you and I suspect there is more to what you're saying than what I'm hearing, suspicion is not a moral failing on my part. It's a perfectly rational response to an information gap.
I accept that suspicion is rational from the outside, but I think it fundamentally misdiagnoses the mechanism. You're framing this gap as a wall designed to keep people out. The source material frames it as a ladder designed to help people climb up. And this brings us to our first core point of friction: secrecy versus developmental opacity.
Developmental opacity is a very sanitized term for withholding information.
Not necessarily. Let's use an analogy everyone understands. Think about the relationship between an adult and a child. To a 6-year-old, the world of adulthood is secretive. They don't understand taxes or romance or existential dread. Now, adults don't hide these things to deceive the child. They withhold them because the child lacks the accumulated experience to metabolize that reality.
So the Cain observer is the child in this analogy. That feels incredibly patronizing.
In terms of interpretive capacity, yes, the material argues that traditions guarding secrets are actually guarding maturation pathways. If you expose a mind to a truth it hasn't developed the cognitive tools to hold, you don't enlighten the person, you distort the truth. It's not about superiority, it's about sequence.
I see the utility of that in parenting, sure. But the source material brings up the Santa Claus analogy, and I think that's where your argument gets really dangerous.
How so? It's a perfect example of scaffolding.
Okay, let's look at it. To a child, Santa Claus is a literal, magical figure who brings toys. To the adult, Santa is a symbol of generosity, parental care, moral order. The structure of the story is unchanged, but the interpretive resolution shifts as the child matures.
Exactly. The narrative remains stable, the listener grows. The literal story was a container for the moral truth until the child was strong enough to hold the truth without the container.
But mechanically, and I'm looking at this as an information theorist, it is deception. You are presenting information in a form that is not fully disclosed. We accept this with children because there is a clear power differential and a duty of care. But the question is, at what point does that scaffolding become manipulation when you apply it between adult groups?
When the intent shifts from growth to exploitation.
But who judges the intent? That's the issue. If one group plays the adult and treats the other group as the child, withholding the structural reality of their communication, that is a profound power dynamic. You call it guarding a maturation pathway, but to the person being kept in the dark, it looks like being handled. It's paternalistic at best and, frankly, conspiratorial at worst.
I see the risk of paternalism, I do, but consider the alternative. The alternative is the destruction of the tool itself. If you hand a complex, high-energy tool to someone who hasn't learned the safety protocols, they break it, or they hurt themselves. The secrecy is the safety protocol. And this isn't just about vague concepts. It's built into the very engineering of the language.
You're referring to the section on the engineering of interpretive language.
Yes, this is one of the strongest points in the material, I think. It argues that features like homophony, identical sounds with multiple meanings, are preserved in these traditions not by accident, but by design.
Cultural engineering is a strong claim for linguistic evolution. I mean, usually languages simplify over time. You're suggesting this tradition kept complications on purpose?
Precisely. Look at how it functions. The source suggests these simultaneous semantic layers force the mind to stay active. If a word can mean to speak and to lead, depending on the context, the listener can't just passively absorb the data. They have to engage in deep reading to decide which meaning is active. It keeps the Abel faculty, the muscle of interpretation, alive.
Like a mental gymnasium.
Think of it like jazz music. To a novice, complex jazz might sound like noise or just random notes, but to the musician, the dissonance is information. They hear the chord substitutions, the callbacks to previous songs, the structural jokes. The complexity isn't there to confuse the audience, it's there to facilitate a higher level of conversation between the players.
That's a beautiful analogy, but let's look at the flip side of the jazz club. I don't dispute that it keeps the muscle alive for those inside the band. My concern is for the people outside looking in. This reliance on reversible phrases and these operator-like relational shifts, it creates a massive barrier to entry.
It creates a barrier to passive entry. It demands effort.
It demands a key. If I cannot hear the simultaneous semantic layer because I wasn't raised in that specific acoustic environment, I am effectively locked out of the real conversation. You argue this protects nuance. I argue that while it may do that, it also creates a valid interpretive distance.
But is that distance the fault of the speaker or the listener? If you go to a physics conference and don't understand the math, are the physicists conspiring against you?
That's a false equivalence. Physics is technical. This is social. We're talking about narratives that define reality. If the Abel group is using homophony to encode a second layer of reality, the outsider isn't just missing the math, they are missing the context of the relationship. They aren't hallucinating the secrecy is structurally built into the grammar. They might mislabel it as conspiracy thinking, you're plotting against them, but they are correctly identifying that they are being kept out of the loop.
They are kept out of the meaning, not the room. But perhaps the tragedy isn't that they are kept out, but that they have lost the ability to get in. I want to pivot to the psychological dimension of this, the concept of the dead brother.
This brings us back to the symbolic hypothesis.
It does. We've been talking about Cain and Abel as groups of people, but the source material urges us to view them as faculties within the self.
The dead brother, Abel, is a latent capability within us. Within the modern individual?
Yes. The argument is that modern mechanistic thinking, the Cain mindset, has effectively committed fratricide in our own brains. We have suppressed the part of our cognition that reads the world symbolically. We demand data, we demand literalism, we demand control. The dead brother is that lost capacity for poetic logic.
So the conflict isn't between two people in a field. It is a civil war in the mind.
Precisely. And because we have killed that capacity in ourselves, we project that conflict outward. We attack ambiguity in others because we have repressed it in ourselves. We demand they speak plainly because we have lost the ear for music.
That is a compelling, almost Freudian framing. It internalizes the struggle very nicely. But I have to push back with the historical record. The source material explicitly references cultural conquest narratives.
It treats them as symbolic descriptions of this psychological process.
But they reference real events. You cannot psychoanalyze away history. If the killing of Abel symbolizes the replacement of interpretive cultures with systems of control, then the conflict is also external. I mean, it mirrors the way indigenous high-context cultures were disrupted or erased by dominant literalist colonial systems.
I don't deny the history.
But you risk minimizing it by making it purely psychological. My concern is that if you prioritize the symbolic reading, saying it's all just inside our heads, you risk erasing the actual suppression that occurred. Real cultures with Abel characteristics, nuance, oral tradition, layered meaning, were silenced by Cain civilizations that wielded contracts, literalism, and steel. It wasn't just a psychological shift, it was a violent displacement.
That is true, and it is a heavy truth. But the source argues that the narrative survives because it is archetypal. It explains why that violence happens. It happens because the Cain mindset, literalism, cannot tolerate the ambiguity of Abel. The literalist feels threatened by the poet.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most difficult point of friction: fluency versus trickery.
Layered fluency, to be precise.
Right. The source material contains a beautiful but very troubling line.
Perceived deception is the shadow cast by unshared fluency.
I find that profound. The goal of this layered speech isn't to trick anyone. It is to signal across contexts simultaneously. It is an instrument of dimensional communication. It allows a speaker to address a child, an adult, and a sage in the same sentence, with each hearing the truth they are capable of bearing.
That sounds noble in theory. It sounds like the ideal teacher. But I must remind you of the admission in the source text regarding ethics. The ethical quality is determined by intent, not by structure.
And I agree. Structure is neutral. Intent provides the morality.
And therein lies the problem. Intent is invisible to the outsider. You can tell me that your layered speech is for protecting nuance or signaling across contexts, but I have no way to verify that you aren't using it for manipulation.
You rely on trust.
Trust requires transparency. If you're using an encryption key I don't have, I can't trust the message. Since intent is hidden, the tension between mysticism and suspicion is a permanent structural feature of this dynamic. You cannot explain it away by telling people to listen better. As long as the fluency is unshared, the shadow of deception will remain.
I see why you think that, and I accept that the tension is permanent. But I believe that shadow is the price of depth. If we remove the layering to satisfy the suspicion of the literalist, we destroy the meaning itself. We flatten the world to make it safe for Cain. We kill Abel again.
Or we acknowledge that transparency has value too. We acknowledge that high-context secrecy, however well-intentioned, creates legitimate social friction that cannot be dismissed as mere ignorance. We have to be honest about the cost of that depth.
And that friction is where we find ourselves today. It's not a problem to be solved, but a dynamic to be understood. As you wrap up, I just want to summarize my view on this Abel hypothesis.
Please do.
Abel represents a mode of perception that we are in danger of losing, the ability to hear the structural music of language. We live in a world that demands literal, flat, immediate information. We want the tweet, not the poem. But the source material reminds us that secrecy in these traditions is often merely the preservation of this capacity until the listener is ready to receive it. The Abel faculty is not dead. It is only hidden, waiting for interpretive cognition to be cultivated again. We have to learn to read the world and not just scan it.
And I will summarize by saying that while this structural isomorphism model is incredibly sharp, we must remain aware of how interpretive asymmetry functions in the real world. Acknowledging that meaning is not possessed, it is practiced, is a powerful idea. But I must warn that as long as language is used to coordinate without explicit exposure of structure, the friction between the literal and the symbolic perspectives will remain. The outsider is not wrong to feel a distance. The distance is real.
A valid warning. The source material invites us to look at our own capacity for perception. It asks us to question, are we reading the world literally, seeing only the surface?
Or are we able, pun intended, to see the architecture beneath that surface?
Thank you for joining us for the debate.
Thank you.